make use of all the time. Thank you all. My name's Tim Bonner. I'm the Chief Executive of the Alliance. I have to start, as I usually do when I'm in Scotland, by apologising for being English. We are short of a Scottish director at the moment. Jamie Stewart, who many of you will have worked with over the years, has left us to run the Tweed Commission, which I think there's a job which has probably got some politics in it. But and we're currently recruiting. So anyone before or after election who's interested in the role, we'd be very happy to hear from you. So I'm covering for the moment. And I'm extremely grateful, especially to the four politicians for joining us tonight. I know it'll be a frantic period, even this rather strange election we're running at the moment. And as well as the online audience who are here with us tonight, we'll also be recording this and making it available to our members and supporters across Scotland. So thank you very much again for coming along. COVID, of course, has dominated rural policy, rural issues, and as well as the election, and it will continue to present immense challenges, which I'm sure that people will want to discuss. But in advance of the election, the Alliance has launched its own manifesto, Priorities for Rural Scotland, and I thought there's a key focus around there. Issues aside, is that we have laid out our belief that whoever forms the next government, they should be pursuing policy based on sound evidence and research, taking into consideration the wider impacts of those policies on all the communities that they will affect, and critically that for rural Scotland, that policies are designed to do things for the countryside, not just to do things to the countryside. And then we believe that if there's a huge opportunity to protect, connect, to grow and enrich rural Scotland, if we get the right policies implemented in the right way. So tonight we have an exciting lineup from across the political spectrum in Scotland, and from all parts of the country. We're lucky to have such a distinguished panel, and I'm delighted to welcome the four politicians we have tonight. Katrina Bhatia is the Scottish Liberal Democrat spokesman for rural economy and tourism, and she's standing on the South of Scotland regional list. John Erskine is the Scottish Labour spokesperson for energy connectivity in the islands, and he's standing for elections in the Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch constituency. Fergus Ewing, of course, is the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy and Tourism, and he's standing for re-election in the Inverness and Nairn constituency for the SNP. Oliver Mundell from the Scottish Conservatives is standing for re-election in Dumfriesshire. I was going to start by asking each of our speakers in turn to set out what their priorities and the priorities of their parties are, and how those would fit with the Scottish Countryside Alliance's objectives. We then have a range of questions which have been put to us from members. Some of those we've put together, and hopefully we'll cover as much as we can in the limited time available, a good selection of the key issues which are going to be affecting rural Scotland and which can be decided by this election. So if we could start in alphabetical order. Sorry, Katrina, to give you a start. If we could start with you, and if you could give us a couple of minutes on your priorities and those of the Scottish Liberal Democrats.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to the Countryside Alliance for inviting me along to your hustings this evening. I hope to be able to impart some of our policies, but also to listen to what your concerns are and your views are, and how we might be able to work together in the future. So the Scottish Liberal Democrats, our priority is to put recovery first. The rural economy is already worth a quarter of the whole Scottish economy, and it's important that it thrives and grows. Our plans for rural and remote areas will see thousands of new jobs and public services developed locally. So we want to start, for example, a programme to consider new civil service jobs and government agencies for rural locations. And that's by learning from the remote working, which was actually so successful during the pandemic. We also want to encourage colleges to become rural enterprise hubs, meeting local skills and needs and supporting innovative new businesses. And we also want to ensure that traditional rural skills such as gamekeeping, dry stone diking, farriers, etc., are promoted within schools and offer a potential pathway for all young people, no matter where they live or what their background. The rollout of superfast broadband is absolutely essential to support business growth, education and public services in rural areas. And sadly, both the Conservative and SNP governments have failed rural communities on broadband, creating an unacceptable disadvantage for residents and businesses in the countryside. We also want to increase support for the NHS and social care in rural areas to increase the number of skilled professionals living in those communities, and support for those who need it to remain in their homes and local communities as well. We want to extend the amount of teacher training that can also be undertaken remotely, making it easier for people in remote island or rural areas to train and carry out their placements locally, and also to remain in their teaching posts within rural areas and continue their professional development. We take very seriously the concerns regarding rural crime, which is not given a high enough priority now that there is no local accountability within the police. And we are acutely aware of the increase in the number of people accessing the countryside without perhaps due consideration of the fact that they have a responsible right of access rather than just the right to roam. So we want to see investment in improved facilities such as toilets and designated camping areas. So really what we need is the next government to have focus and not distractions, and we want to get on with the job of recovery and repair, and repairing the damage to the economy and their education, the health service, the climate and jobs. And Scottish Liberal Democrats will continue to put the recovery first. Thank you.
Katrina, thank you. That was very broad and I think hugely helpful for, I'm sure, for many of the questions that will come. John, you're away next. Could you give us a view of Labour's priorities in rural Scotland and yours as well?
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and good evening to everyone here, and thanks again to the Alliance for organising tonight's hustings. Firstly, Scottish Labour understands the importance of decentralisation of decision making. We support local people developing and implementing policy themselves and being trusted by government to direct money and resources to where it's most effective. We support rural mandating guidance for local authorities, and we commit to putting in place rural-proofing structures for all policy and legislation. This means taking into account the voices of rural Scotland and those living with lived experience of the issues. We know that businesses in our countryside have had an incredibly difficult time. For the tourist industry, the pandemic has devastated the market, and agricultural businesses have also seen markets and supply chains come under pressure from COVID and Brexit, and have also had to manage the effects of the climate emergency on their livelihoods. So Scottish Labour pledges to support the tourism sector with a business restart fund and a sectoral recovery deal and a sustainable national plan for tourism. In terms of support for the agricultural sector, we want to put in place long-term plans for farm payments, protecting farm income, and linking payments to baseline environmental commitments. We want to make sure that jobs in the countryside lead to careers. We will tackle low wages and precarious terms and conditions through our good work plans by strengthening the role of the Agricultural Wages Board. And we also want to attract more people into rural employment, and we'll support new entrants into farming, food production, and the processing industries. We understand businesses and rural Scotland in general cannot thrive without adequate infrastructure. So we want to invest in connectivity and ensure that all of Scotland is able to access superfast internet connectivity. Like Scotland's urban areas, our countryside is also suffering from a housing crisis. There's not enough homes in the right places, and many of the houses are unsuitable for those living there. So at this election, Scottish Labour believes we can't go back to the old arguments. And instead, we want this election to focus on delivering a national recovery plan that works for all of Scotland's communities and will allow us to recover from the pandemic in a fairer and more sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That's really helpful. Fergus, I don't think any of us could have imagined the last time you're standing for election that we'd be here now after the last 12 months in particular, and what it must have been like to be in government during that period it's unthinkable, really. But I think we'd be really interested to hear how the SNP proposes to bring us out of to create the recovery that's so needed in rural Scotland after the pandemic, and what your priorities and the party's priorities are for rural Scotland.
Well, thank you, Tim, and also thanks to Jamie for all his work. I worked closely with him for many years. Our priorities are to support sustainable growth in the rural economy, and the 4 Fs, as I call them, fishing, farming, forestry and field sports, are all in their own different ways pillars of rural life in Scotland, part of our culture and tradition. They all have different demands and challenges, and we need to support them all. And like the other speakers, we also need to improve the provisions of broadband, which we're doing through R100, a £600 million contract, the largest in the UK, which will be rolled out per our plans with the use of vouchers as an interim expedient, as we promised. But I think there's a more fundamental point I would like to make, Tim, perhaps, and that is this, that when I was first elected 22 years ago, I had been running a legal business in Glasgow for most of the previous 2 decades. And I had a lot to learn about the countryside, representing Inverness, East Nairn and Lochaber, a largely rural patch. And I went out of my way to speak to people like Jamie Williamson, Davy Thompson, Alex Hogg, the late Ronnie Rose, to learn about country practices, to understand better how important gamekeepers are, what gillies do, why land management carried out properly is fine. I launched the snaring guidelines at Moy some years ago, for example, and learnt how that if done properly, it is well done. So I think the challenge for the next Parliament, Tim, is that all major parties, and I know the Greens are not here this evening, I don't know whether they were invited or not, but all the major parties, I think, have got a duty to listen to the countryside. You know, the late Margaret MacDonald once told me, conversation is shots each. And politicians are good at talking, but maybe we're not always so good at listening. And I think listening to the people who actually do the work in the rural economy, whether they be gamekeepers, farmers, crofters, land managers, foresters, gillies, or others, that's really what we need to do. And that's what I've sought to do as an MSP and a minister in doing my best to support and further, for example, field sports in various positive ways, which I hope have done some good in rural Scotland. And I promise to carry on doing that if I have the opportunity after the 6th of May.
Thank you. That's really helpful, folks. I can confirm that the Greens were invited, but didn't take up the invitation. Oliver, if you could give us a moment on the Conservative priorities for rural Scotland and your personal priorities as well.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to everyone who's given up a sunny evening to sit in front of Zoom after a year and a bit of doing this. I think the kind of novelty factor wears off, but it already sounds like it's going to be a good discussion. I feel very strongly as someone who's grown up in a rural area, who represents a rural area, that the Scottish Parliament has done a very poor job for rural Scotland across the last 20 years. I think it hasn't ultimately delivered. And I think a combination of our voting system and political choices that have been made in Holyrood means that the voice of rural Scotland hasn't always been heard. And under this current SNP government, I do feel there has been a central belt and an urban bias, and I don't doubt that Fergus listens. I just think that he's struggled at times to convince some of his colleagues to and help them understand what rural Scotland's all about. And I feel that the Conservative Party through the last 5 years, but really since the Parliament's creation, has been the only party that's been unapologetic in its support for rural traditions and that's sought to stand up for the needs of people in rural and remote communities. And personally, having read through the Countryside Alliance manifesto, I very strongly back it, and I think there's many things within it that are urgent priorities. I think if we're going to tackle rural depopulation, if we're going to address the fact that many young people leave our rural communities not necessarily through choice, and we need to make sure that policy is rural proofed and that we're creating opportunities for people living in the countryside. I think broadband's right at the top of that list, and I'm pleased that the Scottish Conservatives have committed to full fibre broadband by 2027. I also think, as other speakers have mentioned, that housing's a key part of that. We need to get more affordable housing into rural communities. I think too often we concentrate on sheer numbers and volume rather than making sure that there is affordable housing in smaller communities. And I think the third thing is about preserving the rural way of life. I feel many rural traditions have been under attack in the past few years. For me, one of the clearest examples was the vote that took place on Mountain Hares, where it was suddenly sprung at stage 3 of a bill without taking any evidence from rural communities or those with direct experience of the issue. And that seems to happen too often at Holyrood, and rural issues become a political football rather than, as you said in your opening, being based on the evidence. So I would say to Countryside Alliance members, returning more Scottish Conservative MSPs at this election means a stronger voice for rural Scotland within the Parliament. And I think we need to make our focus making the countryside a great place to live, work and enjoy, rather than focusing on villainising those who are often just doing their job and working hard to protect rural economies. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. That again is really helpful. I think there's a range of issues that come out of there, which we may pick up later. I think I might, given the limited time, I think they all covered the broadband issue fairly effectively. There's a couple of issues, a couple of questions I've got here, which perhaps in areas that we haven't that weren't covered quite so much in some of those introductory pieces. I think perhaps rural crime in particular. The Alliance did some work last year, did a survey, and there was real concern coming out of that about underreporting. Essentially, our work suggested that 32% of those, a third of people in the countryside, didn't think that the police took rural crime as seriously as they did other crime. And up to 39% of those who've been victims of rural crime didn't report it. And this in turn leads to potentially a cycle of decline, where because the statistics of rural crime aren't reported, we don't get the funding, and therefore there's a perception that the police aren't taking it seriously. And as I say, there's a potential for a spiral of decline. So perhaps we could start by asking you individually, and I'll don't worry, Katrina, I'll shake the thought so you get to go first every time. If I could ask all of you, what would your party do? What would you do to break that potential cycle of decline in rural policing? Perhaps John, you could start us off on that.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I mean, it's a serious issue, and I've spoken to lots of people in the Highlands and Islands and my own constituency here of Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch that reflect the views that are in the Alliance's manifesto. So absolutely, I do agree we need to do a lot more to tackle rural crime. We look at things like, I had a meeting with BASC, the British Association of Shooting and Conservation, the other week, and their evidence also backs up the issue that many rural workers, for example, are facing abuse, are having a hard time in the workplace. And again, that's something that's totally unacceptable. And I think, again, time and time again, rural communities and workers do feel neglected by government, whether that's local government or Scottish government. So we really need to listen to the voices of this sector and take action to make sure that we can tackle these issues. Seen a huge uptick in rural tourism over the summer months and the initial lockdowns, and there's big issues in my patch over things like dirty camping, and landowners are having huge difficulties with that and quite often feel the police aren't taking it as seriously as they need to as well. So I think we need to have a holistic view at all the issues facing the sector, and we do seriously need to listen to the voices and the concerns of people working in the sector to make sure that we can tackle these issues face on. Oliver was absolutely right to say that the Parliament hasn't lived up to its ambitions in the last couple of terms. And, I think the next Parliament seriously has to return to a focus on rural Scotland and how we can tackle the issues the sector's facing. So certainly I back a lot of what's in the manifesto you've got on tackling rural crime and like to see the next Parliament take that forward.
Thank you, John. Fergus, how do we tackle this perception that the police aren't taking rural crime as seriously as they do other crime?
I don't think it is the reality. It may be the perception, but I have been involved in many meetings with partnership bodies, including the police, who are tackling rural crime. I think some of the most effective work is done in crime prevention to help, for example, farmers protect farm equipment against theft, to take steps to assist in tackling crime as well. So I don't think the generalized criticism of the police is necessarily fair. I mean, plainly, crime that, for example, fly tipping that occurs in rural, the difficulty the police have is witnesses and evidence. And I do think that the police will take matters seriously, provided we can amass sufficient evidence, but that's sometimes very difficult by the very nature of the fact that there's rarely witnesses to much of the crime that causes so many problems. We, I think, should look at penalties to see whether they're sufficient deterrent. In addition to that, regarding the sort of dirty camping issues of sort of a bins, waste disposal, toilets, we have done a great deal of work, including funding for more rangers, more work from the Forest Enterprise and their campsites, and £6 million in tackling infrastructure fund. And in addition, Emma Harper has passed her bill, which aims to some extent tackle the sheep worrying issue by dogs, which was very welcome by the farming community. But I do think the last Parliament has invested a lot of time and positive effort in rural matters, including rural crime. And I don't think it's a constant focus on how we can tackle particularly fly tipping, which is the problem that farmers are kind of left to tackle themselves, is extremely important, and it's something that I would like to continue to work on in the next Parliament, if I'm a member of it, and if we're in government.
Thank you, Fergus. I'd like to be really clear that the work we did is not about criticising the police, it's just recording the perception. And yeah, there is an old saying, isn't there? The perception is reality, and that's the concern. I think that it's how that perception has developed and how to challenge it. Oliver, rural crime.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the reality is people don't feel it's worth reporting rural crime because they know it's not going to be investigated, and what they, the times when people do it's to get a crime number so they can make a claim on insurance where they have it. And I think the police are under-resourced. I think what we've seen under the SNP is a kind of stripping out of backroom resource within policing. And as Katrina had mentioned, as part of the kind of changes to Police Scotland, some of the local policing links have been lost. I know certainly here in Dumfries and Galloway, there are many police officers who are frustrated at some of the systems that are in place, and things have started to get a little bit better. But we certainly support a local policing act to try and restore some of those links and make priorities clearer. And when Fergus mentions sheep worrying, one of the things that shocked me most in the last 5 years was the evidence that came forward as part of that bill, where we had senior NFU representatives confirming what I suspect is the case, that the police feel under more pressure to investigate other rural crimes and crimes against wildlife that they see as being more of a political priority than helping farmers protect their livestock. And I also again feel that there's just a sort of attitude that somehow rural workers just have to absorb what in any other workplace would be abuse bordering often on assault. And again, I think that needs to be stamped out. I was pleased to put forward a motion recognising some of the research that had come forward on that. And again, the sadness for me was that even when it comes to the abuse faced by rural workers, there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm across the chamber to show solidarity to show solidarity with gamekeepers. And I just think some of it's about attitude, and I think we've got to, as politicians, make it clear that these things matter, and that crimes against rural businesses and rural people are every bit as important as other crime.
Thank you, Oliver. Katrina.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think this does in some part stem from the centralisation of Police Scotland, which the Liberal Democrats were the only party to oppose. The links that there were between local police officers, local chief constables and their communities was broken when things were centralised. You report things now into Bilston, you know that nothing's going to be done about it. It's just, as Oliver was saying, to get a crime number to claim on insurance. So I think we need to look very seriously about how we can get back to some more localised policing. I know that there are ward police plans, but they tend to focus on the more urban areas. They tend to be consumed by parking and speeding and things which are important to some members of rural communities, but it's not the rural crime which goes on out with our urban areas. So I think one of the really important aspects of tracking rural crime is actually on social media. And I know that through my own social media channels, because I have some horses, so I'm on lots of farmers' Facebooks, and they're always tipping each other off about suspicious vehicles. So there's a lot of low-level intelligence which is being collated by country folk. The question is, how does that then get acted upon? I take your point. I think that preventative measures have been quite successful, and I think the loss of particularly agricultural shows and the Highland show in the last year or so with the pandemic has been really detrimental to that sort of dialogue between the police and other bodies and the rural communities, particularly with high impact crimes in terms of machinery, quad bikes, things like that, as well as actual livestock being either attacked or indeed stolen. So in terms of how we tackle it, I think we need to get back to a much more local way of policing, and that will then mean that there's much more connection between rural communities and those who are there to protect them.
Thank you, Sreen. I think we might pick up some of those issues about other priorities and political pressure later on, if we have time, and with another question I've got. But moving on from crime, I think no one will be surprised that we've had quite a few questions about hunting with hounds, and I think I'd like just to put to the panel the current situation, as they will be aware, is that Lord Bonamy was asked by the Scottish Parliament to review hunting legislation, and he came back with what we saw as a very clear endorsement of the use of dogs and packs of hounds in pest control, and its use in fox control and in support of farmers in particular. And just to quote him, he said, the use of packs of hounds to flush out foxes to be shot remains a significant pest control measure, both to control the general level of foxes as well as address particular problems affecting a farm. And in relation to proposals which have been made consistently without any evidence to reduce the number of dogs that people can use in pest control to 2. Lord Bonamy was very clear again, saying that searching and flushing by 2 dogs would not be as effective as that done by a full pack of hounds, and that imposing such a restriction could seriously compromise effective pest control in the country. That is the position of the review, and I don't think anyone could suggest that Lord Bonamy wasn't very clear in his view there. And subsequent to his review, scientific research which concludes that the use of packs of dogs is both more effective and humane than using 2 dogs has been peer-reviewed and published in a journal. So Claire Bellamy, of the many questions we picked out, Claire Bellamy, who someone knows, huntsman of the Lauderdale hunt, therefore asks whether the panel thinks she should be allowed to continue to carry on carrying out the essential and effective pest control, flushing foxes to be shot, that she does for farmers in her part of the country. And as a practitioner, Claire notes that it would be, she believes it would be impossible to do so effectively with only 2 hounds. Could I start, Fergus, could I start with you on that one, please?
Yes, well, to answer the question directly, I think pest control, first of all, is necessary. And second of all, the way in which it traditionally has been carried out with the use of dogs to flush out foxes to the gun has been tried and tested for a long, long time. And I think it is a necessary method of pest control. I think there's a distinction between that and the activity of hunting for sporting purposes, and has expressed its view very clearly that hunting for sport is not something that is favoured. I looked at all of these things with cross-party colleagues, Alex Ferguson, Mike Rumbles, Elaine Murray of the Labour Party, and we devised in the Watson Bill an exemption which allowed the traditional methods you've described, Tim, to be continued. I think that showed that there was a consensus resulting from the evidence, because I can assure you that we considered then on the Rural Committee, chaired by the late Alex Ferguson, very widely respected politician, and we came to a conclusion, all 4 parties, that this traditional practice actually was the most humane way of dealing with it, which quickly dispatched the fox in almost all circumstances, and was carried out by professionals. I've met the professionals. I've met people like Paul Croft, people like Alex Hogg, who carry out this work in a professional fashion. And I do think that although there is in the Scottish Parliament a clear view against hunting for sporting purposes, pursuing foxes for sporting purposes, and that issue I think really is settled, whatever one may think about it, I think that issue is settled and in the past. But if I'm re-elected, then I would hope that I can be a strong rural voice, which will make sure that the strong evidence showing that these traditional practices, which had cross-party support 20 years ago, are matters which should be allowed to continue to control pests. And it is essential not only for farming, but for forestry and other reasons to control foxes. And of course, the last thing I would say, Tim, is that I've seen the evidence from farmers of what happens if foxes aren't controlled, pecking out eyes of lambs and so on. So the pest control itself protects other livestock from, if you like, a cruel and painful death. And that's a sensitive thing to discuss, but that is the reality. And I learned that reality when I listened to those that gave evidence 20 years ago. I very much doubt that evidence has changed.
Thank you, Fergus. Oliver.
Yeah, I can give a much shorter answer, which is just yes. I think the questioner is correct, and I very much hope that the next Parliament will come to that view. I'll be honest. I'm worried after things I've seen, of what the SNP and Greens might do, but I think the current legislation works well.
Thank you, Oliver. Remarkably succinct. Thank you. Katrina.
Yeah, I think there's one thing in politics is never be hypocritical. And many years ago, I have followed a hunt, and my daughters, if we had a hunt near her, would go more often. They enjoy it as a sport, but also in the contribution that it makes to controlling the pest that is a fox. And I think the consensus, political consensus, is generally that it's been accepted, as Fergus was saying. But I think the Scottish Greens have certainly said that they would seek to ban it. I think Labour are sort of moving in that direction in terms of mounted followers of hounds. And I think we need to be very careful that the Greens are not throwing this as a nugget for support for independence in the next Parliament. So I think, it's looked on as a minority sport, which, it is. Some people look at it as a class war, which it isn't. Many of the people I know that go hunting are, just ordinary farming folk or country folk who just would like to have a day out. So I think it's unfortunate that it's characterised in that way. And I think that it's one of these issues which there's a lot more heat than light on it. And I think that a lot of people who live in urban areas, I think the last time I saw a fox was on the front doorstep of a friend's house in Tufnell Park in London. I think they would be delighted if they had as effective a way of managing their fox population. So we certainly would not be seeking to amend the legislation.
Thank you. Thank you, Katrina. John, what's the Labour Party position?
Thanks. Well, firstly, I just want to say, I mean, Fergus is absolutely right that, you know, we have to draw that distinction between sport and pest management. I mean, the Labour Party, you know, we want to work hand in hand with the sector, and we want to protect jobs and the environment. But at the same time, we are the party of animal welfare. So, you know, I would personally like to see the practice stopped. But I think the Labour Party as a whole is more cautious, and we certainly want to make sure that we wouldn't rush into any changes. I think Katrina is absolutely right. The Green Party are mercenary, and they will take advantage at any opportunity to push these things through. But the next Parliament needs to take into account the voices of the Alliance and the whole rural economy sector in Scotland to make sure that we do make sure any changes in legislation are cautious. So I appreciate that won't go down too well with folk here tonight, but you know, animal welfare for me does come first.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for honesty. And all I would say, because we can and do quite often end up arguing about this subject all night, but all I would say is I'd ask all of you to consider the evidence and the commitment to evidence-based legislation when you're considering this. And yeah, Lord Bonamy did that, and I'd ask you to look at what he concluded. I think before we go on, there's a health question, but I think given the last discussion, there's a question about the operation of the Scottish Parliament and minority rights, which I think is quite relevant to this and some of the previous discussions we had as well. So I think we might move to that. Because we have had a number of questions raising concerns about the influence of pressure groups on the legislative agenda. Pressure groups, and perhaps we should add in there smaller political parties as well, especially with the benefit of, as they would see it, of electronic and social media campaigning. I think perhaps the best way of putting it together is by asking the panel whether they can reassure the rural community, which is, of course, significantly in the minority in Scotland, how the Scottish Parliament, and again, without perhaps the checks and balances of a reviewing or revising chamber, which we see in other legislative systems, how can they guarantee the rights of minority groups and the rural minority, obviously in particular, and avoid the threat of a dictatorship of the majority? I can't remember where we've got to. I think, Oliver, you're away on this first, if you could.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is I can't guarantee that, because I've seen it happen, you know, too many times, and I think the Scottish Parliament relies on the committee system working, and Fergus, to be fair, gave a really good example of that, you know, in the past. But I think too often on the Parliament's committees, you know, they tend to be swayed by politics rather than the evidence that comes forward. And I think, you know, we need to focus on the evidence and making good legislation. I think too often we're keen to pass bills so that we can say we've achieved a policy objective, and it's not just that doesn't just apply to rural issues. I think it happens with other things as well, where we like to pass legislation so that we can say that we've done something. But if you don't listen to the evidence that comes forward from people on the ground, from people with direct expertise, then you're not going to have legislation that works in practice. And I think that's one of the challenges. And you know, for me, you know, I'm very keen always to listen to constituents, and I put much more value on what people who live in my constituency say, and what those people actually send in, because I think too often, you know, we see these sort of standardised responses or campaign emails, and you know, I think, you know, the time and effort involved in signing a petition, you know, or clicking something based on partial information, you know, is very different to someone sharing, you know, their own professional or personal lifelong experience. I think we've got to listen to not just to the evidence, but to the right evidence from people who know what they're talking about.
You've depressed everyone now, Oliver. Katrina, could we have you on that, please?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, the Scottish Parliament was set up to have coalition governments, because that's the norm in most European countries and sort of other civilized nations, because no political party has the answers to everything. So actually working together, the Liberal Democrats would say, is a good thing, but it is about not allowing undue influence. And I think particularly when it comes to minorities, and I think this has slightly been skewed in the last decade with the continual referendums, which are not usually part of the British democratic system. And that means that people have to take polarized positions, and they've begun to think that the majority view is always the one that should prevail. In actual fact, a mature democracy, the way it treats minorities and reflects minority views, I think is more important than actually always pandering to the majority. So I think this Scottish Parliament, having been established for 20 years, does need some reform. Scottish Liberal Democrats love some constitutional reform and voting reform, so we would adopt a different voting system of single transferable vote, which you have in the council elections, which would give a more proportional and reflective balance of MSPs. And I think we also need to look at how the committee system operates, given that there isn't a revising chamber, to make sure that it's much more evidence-based, evidence-led, and less party political. So I think that's a job to do. And if we don't get ourselves too hung up on trying to leave the UK, then I think that's something which we could work together to achieve.
Thank you. John, how would you reassure the rural minority?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what Katrina was saying there. I do think the Scottish Parliament, after 20 years, isn't working the way it was originally set up to do. So Scottish Labour have proposed a clean-up Holyrood Commission to consult on ideas to get the Parliament working better, because as we've seen in the last term, especially, it has passed a lot of fairly poor legislation that we've had to come back. Things like the Football Act were forced through and then had to be repealed because they were just not fit for purpose. So we do absolutely need to look at how the Parliament functions to make sure we can hold the executive to account effectively. I think things like the election of committee conveners would also be really helpful and would give the committees much more power than they currently have. And I think we also need to look at fundamentally the amount of amendments that can be tagged on to stage 3 bills in the Parliament, because quite often bills which are carefully considered at committee stage and stage 1 and 2 end up being amended quite radically at the final stage. And I think that's probably not a healthy thing for the Parliament to be doing. And we're losing a lot of the expertise and evidence that goes into forming a bill at an earlier stage. So absolutely, we want to see a committee to clean up Holyrood, reform the Parliament, and make sure it works so that rural communities and all communities in Scotland in the minority are heard, and no legislation is passed that will affect them adversely without their voices being heard.
Thank you for that, John. Fergus, this may be something that you have to tackle after the election. How will you reassure the rural minority?
Well, I think it's not all doom and gloom. And just 3 quick examples. I was able, I think, to persuade colleagues there should be, in tackling COVID, Tim, a countryside sports fund to assist certain businesses whose custom, frankly, had disappeared because of COVID. So their businesses had gone, no income, that they should get support. Secondly, I was able with colleagues to and Rosanna Cunningham, notably actually, to lift the tail docking ban. And the tail docking ban had really caused cruelty to dogs who were prone to injury, which didn't readily heal in undocked tails. And we got the evidence together. So that was another example of evidence leading to a good result, I think, for those in the countryside. And thirdly, working together with all the countryside voices, we managed to recover from Westminster £160 million for farmers and crofters, and that's gone into the economy for the last 2 years. And I personally led that campaign along with Jim Walker, farming former NFUS president, and support from cross parties. So it's not all doom. But one thing I would say is that I think the practice of introducing new ideas that haven't been properly considered in stage 1, particularly at stage 3, is wrong. It didn't happen, Tim, as far as I recall, under the first 3 parliaments, under the first 4 parliaments rather. So I think the practice of allowing new ideas to be brought in at the very last minute without proper evidence being produced is a perversion of the practices of Parliament. And I do hope it's really up to the presiding officer, I think, in the new Parliament, whoever he or she may be, to stop this practice and revert to the practice that I may say that Katrina's father introduced. And when I was a young Turk, or as near a young Turk as I was ever likely to be, I tried to introduce stuff at stage 3, and David Steele gave me short shrift. And, you know, I wasn't happy at the time, but actually I can see he was quite right, because Parliament hadn't had a proper chance to debate it through. And that, I think, is the issue of principle. And that's my view, my personal view about how we could improve matters in a way that would avoid minorities becoming antagonized and feeling that they weren't being listened to at all.
Thank you, Fergus. With nothing else, we may have the basis of a cross-party campaign coming out of tonight's discussion, because there does seem to be a shocking outbreak of agreement on that issue, if nothing else. Thank you all for that. I'm going to move on. As I said, we had a question from Dr. Baird, who I think is on the call, in relation to health. Dr. Baird's worked in rural communities across Scotland, and he quotes research that shows that rural patients have higher death rates in road traffic accidents, for asthma, for cancer, and that Scottish urban cancer patients benefit from almost 3 times more specialist inpatient care than rural patients. He makes the point that socio-economic deprivation lacks a valid and measurable indicator of rural deprivation, being biased towards inner city issues. And he also notes that the 2018 GP contract focused on urban issues with a reduction in primary care funding throughout rural Scotland, while urban practices gained, an issue still not resolved. So Dr. Baird's question is, what does the panel feel is the best way to ensure that rural patients receive a fair and reasonable solution to these problems of access to what are now centralised services? I think we've been all the way around. So Katrina, if you could start us off on that one.
Well, we absolutely have to provide professional support for health workers to be able to work in our more rural areas. I mean, we have a situation where, you know, there's no inpatient child mental health facilities north of the Central Belt. I mean, that's a scandal. That means that, you know, if somebody has a child who has a severe mental health difficulty, they have to, you know, they won't be able to see them, they won't be able to communicate with them, they can't be part of that community. So, and that's just one example where the ongoing centralisation, which has been a real hallmark of the SNP government, is really damaging our rural areas. You know, you've got women who are in pregnancy having to travel miles and miles to, you know, to the nearest hospital to give birth. There's no support for them to have home births. The GP's contracts, as Dr. Baird was saying, have been very much centred around clusters which are focused on urban areas. So I think we've really got to have a root and branch review about how the NHS operates within Scotland. Of course, if you're having a very significant heart operation, you want to have it done by a heart surgeon who practices that regularly. You don't want somebody who just does it once a month, because they need the professional expertise to be able to do that. So, you know, there is an argument for some centralised and specialist facilities, but for general care, and particularly for mental health support and primary care support, that has to be done on a much more local level. And I know that certainly rural workers suffer from a high number of sort of industrial accidents. So again, that sort of preventative public health message has got to get out into our rural communities. So we would certainly, I think I said in my introduction, look at how we can facilitate that and make sure that there's expertise throughout the country and not just in the Central Belt.
Thank you, Katrina. John, how do we ensure a solution to the problems that Dr. Baird has outlined?
Yeah, entirely legitimate to raise those issues. I mean, it's a huge issue in the Highlands and Islands and the Northeast. You know, Scottish Labour have been clear that we want this election to be about a national recovery plan, and one of our 5 pillars is an NHS recovery plan, because services in vast parts of Scotland aren't working. You know, I look at my own backyard here, and NHS Highland have seen so many services centralised to Inverness. People in Fort William, for example, are still waiting on a new hospital to be developed, and we've got one of the busiest hospitals in the west coast of Scotland there, with totally insufficient funding and insufficient bed numbers. So we really need to get new hospitals built. We've seen maternity services in Caithness reduced to nothing, and expectant mothers having to travel 3 hours sometimes by ambulance to Inverness. It's absolutely shocking. And as Katrina said, there's a severe lack of mental health support and funding, which again affects many people living in rural areas across Scotland. So we absolutely need the next Parliament to stop focusing on the arguments of the past and instead focus on an NHS recovery to make sure that there is adequate staffing, adequate funding, and adequate services in our NHS in every part of Scotland to support our communities that live out with the Central Belt and major centres of population.
Thank you, John. Fergus, how would the SNP resolve some of these issues?
Well, I'd be very interested to learn more about the research. I'm not familiar with it. I remember I asked the late Tam Diel for advice around about 25 years ago when I was still fairly young about the key thing in politics. What advice would he give me? He said, get your facts right. And I think we shouldn't be too quick just to assume that it's all doom and gloom and that there are absolute distinctions in the way that has been described. For example, children that require serious treatment will very often attend the Sick Kids Hospital in Glasgow. And what hasn't been mentioned is that the parents of such kids who require that very serious treatment will, of course, first of all, want their kids to have the treatment where the experts are. And secondly, that there is in the Ronald McDonald facility, I believe, provision for the parents to sleep over, to stay over whilst their children are being treated. Secondly, I think an issue may be that there is a reluctance with health boards to refer patients that require specialist treatment to Glasgow or Edinburgh, where there is the preponderance of consultants and experts and specialists that are required to give confidence that the best treatment will be available. And that reluctance, I think, might be based on the cost of the referral and the treatment. Thirdly, one has to be realistic about the issues about recruitment. You know, in order to provide safety in serious operations, there needs to be ITU facilities. There needs to be a degree of a cohort of staff. It is simply not possible to provide that everywhere. And that is the reality. And no inquiry is going to alter that reality. Yes, of course, we must have appropriate services for rural dwellers. But I know from my partner's experience, and she's an anaesthetist, that many people from rural Scotland, day and daily, receive expert treatment in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and largely are quite happy to do so. Finally, I think the provision of additional trauma centres, and I think there are 3 at the moment, in places like Inverness, would be an appropriate addition to that service. But I don't think it's a simple question, and therefore I think should eschew making sweeping generalities and offering to sign checks that the public won't be able to draw upon.
Okay. I think Dr. Baird is here, and I see a hand up, but I'm afraid I think given the time and in all fairness, I think perhaps we better put you two together to discuss to discuss the veracity of the statistics. And we'll give Oliver an opportunity to answer the question.
Thank you, Tim. I mean, I think it's difficult to make broad and sweeping statements, but again, as someone who's represented a rural constituency for the last 5 years, I recognise lots of the things that were referenced, and I think to pretend that there aren't huge challenges in rural communities when it comes to healthcare is, again, would be a sweeping statement the other way. And I think for me, Katrina was right when she talked about that balance, the balance between specialist care and the flip side of that, how far people are willing to travel. And I find one of the very sad things I experience here in Dumfriesshire is that often because of the travel and overnight overnight accommodation and sort of other factors, there are lots of people who choose not to go ahead, for example, with cancer treatment because they're balancing how far away and for how long they'll have to be away from their family with the time that they've got left. And yes, we need people to get the best treatment, but sometimes people are looking and willing to accept a slightly lower level of expertise and specialism in order to be treated closer to home. And I think we've got to get that balance right, and I'm not sure we do at the moment. The other thing I think that's happening across Scotland is we're seeing our rural GP network crumble. And in the past, rural GPs have been at the heart of the healthcare system, making sure that patients are getting good treatment, chasing up referrals, and making sure that people get the choice of the options available. And I think that, again, that link between the sort of rural family GP and communities has somewhat broken down. And I'm very pleased that the Conservatives again have pushed on rural GP training. The Scottish Government, to be fair, have done some good work on that as well, but on far too small a scale, as far as I'm concerned. And I think one of the faults with that, again, is that we don't encourage young people or enough young people from rural communities to go into medicine and then come back and live and practice here. And I think the final thing I'd say was just on rural deprivation. I think that's at the heart of this. If there are good opportunities for people living in rural communities where people are doing well and in secure employment and in good housing, then some of the health inequalities reduce by themselves. And again, I think we need to recognise that as a parliament and see that rural poverty and deprivation is every bit as important as what people maybe jump to when talking about urban communities.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you, Dr. Baird, for the question. I think that was a really an interesting discussion. And sorry we haven't got the opportunity for you to pursue that. We'll put your response back to Fergus. We are right on the time, and I'm hugely grateful for the amount of time that the politicians have given us. There are a whole range of other rural issues around management, land reform, and everything else we could have spent hours discussing. But I'm going to try and fail, I think, to roll it up into a question which I'm going to ask you for one word, or at least a one sentence for a response to, which to finish us off tonight, unless anyone else has to say. It's probably a bit unfair, but let's do it anyway. Given the discussion we're having about, especially the management of the Highlands and deer populations, I think a question I think everyone would be quite interested to hear from all the politicians is, would you shoot a deer? John, can I ask you first for your response to that?
Shooting is absolutely a legitimate sport, and Scottish Labour aren't opposed to it at all. There's no apex predators for deer in Scotland, and deer management plays a vital part in managing the deer population in Scotland. So the short answer is yes, I would be willing to do it, but I haven't done it before. I'm not much of a shot anyway, but it's certainly, it's a legitimate practice, and yes.
Yeah. The sentiment is taken, John. Thank you. Fergus.
I myself don't wish to But what I do wish is that we get cross-party support for field sports, the contribution it makes to the rural economy, and a recognition that the expertise of gamekeepers ensures that the sport is carried out in the most humane way in respect of the deer.
Thank you folks. Oliver.
I don't shoot myself, and I just don't see personally don't see the attraction. But I'm 100% supportive of other people's rights to do so. And like Fergus, recognise the very significant contribution field sports make to the rural economy. But more than just the economy, how important they are as part of the traditions we all enjoy in the countryside.
Thank you. And Katrina.
Well, I have been grouse shooting and I was absolutely hopeless shot. So I think for the sake of the deer, I would say no, but I would certainly not be concerned with the deer management, and for those who enjoy stalking to take part in it. And in particular, when the deer is then entering the food chain and arriving on the plate as a delicious piece of venison, I think I'm all in favour of that.
Thank you very much, Katrina. It's 7 o'clock on the dot, and I don't think I've ever managed that before, especially in this. I just want to reiterate the huge thanks to the Scottish Countryside Alliance for everyone there. I know not only was it very kind of you to give you the time, but this format is not easy. I know, and thank you all for doing that. The inability to, as we have all learned in the last year, to read rooms, respond, have that sort of human interaction that we all crave in debate is incredibly difficult. So thank you all very much. I think that was really interesting, a great, extremely helpful for all our members, and some great contributions from all of you. So on behalf of everyone here, can I say thank you very much indeed. Good luck to all of you. I hope to see you all return to Holyrood, and look forward to working closely with you when you are. So thank you all.
Thank you, and thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Good
night.
Bye.
Thanks for organising. Cheers.
Thank you.